Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest in the Witan series of interviews. We're joined today by one of our applicant speakers, one Rupert August. How are you?
Hello, I'm doing well. Spent a lot of time in the past week actually just getting ready for the whole thing and really hashing out what I'm going to say. So
That's perfect. That means you'll be able to speak eloquently at massive length without giving any spoilers at all. Is that right?
Yes, I would hope so. Well, I mean, probably a few spoilers are going to be sort of necessary just to elucidate what I'm actually going to be talking about, but nothing that will reveal the heart of it, I suppose.
Awesome. So before that, do you want to give a small bio on your online presence, or maybe offline presence, whatever you want to do, to say who exactly you are and why you want to speak at the Witan?
Okay. Yeah, I'm just another sort of online personality, terminally online. But I've spent quite a lot of time reading about some esoteric, some less so, historical topics, just trying to sort of find my niche and find what's interesting in the sphere of right-wing thought. What I've ended up settling on is the right-wing, well, recently anyway, is the right-wing aspect of various revolutions, which includes counter-revolutions, something that resembles like a right-wing revolution, or alternatively secret societies that have kind of had revolutionary outcomes.
So revolution normally has left-wing connotations just because most revolutions that we hear about were very left-wing, be it the French, the Russian, the whatever. So when you say a right-wing revolution, what can you give any examples of what that might be, and why is that different from a when we talk about the mid-century Germans, we don't use the word revolution.
No, typically not. I mean, although they talked about it quite a lot. So they perceived themselves as acting in a very revolutionary way. What I've ended up doing is trying to lay out this alternative concept. I'm probably not the first person to come up with it, but the idea of restoration, and setting that against revolution. So revolution is something which is trying to build, well, usually trying to wipe the slate clean in some fashion and then build anew from sort of fairly rationalistic, from a fairly rationalistic perspective. And so they have a model about how things should go or how things should be, and then try to build from fresh foundations on that basis. So that's in particular where you talk about the Russian Revolution or the French Revolution being the operative examples. And then within the context of those two, you have what is usually called counter-revolution, especially by the revolutionaries themselves, trying to isolate people who are working against the revolution. But almost parallel to that, you have other groups which are working within their own context. And obviously the revolutionaries would call them counter-revolutionaries. But actually, just as a quick aside, I think AA actually did a pretty good job talking about that. I think it was last year now, essentially making the point that counter-revolutionaries are simply people who work on behalf of the established government and try to subdue any revolutionary force. And so that might be coming either from a right-wing,
secret police and that sort of thing within the movement.
Yeah, so that can be, the revolution can be working against a left-wing cause. And in that case, the counter-revolutionary forces would be on behalf of the left wing. Obviously, within the rhetoric, they'd still consider themselves to be revolutionaries, working towards their ideal state. Meanwhile, you'd have the right-wing people in this equation potentially working against the revolution, trying to restore what came before, and that's kind of some of the space that I'm trying to highlight. In particular,
go on.
Yeah, sorry. So in particular, the best example I would say is the restoration of the Ancien regime, half done after the French Revolution was brought down, after Napoleonic France was ended. The attempt to bring back the monarchy, bring back the Bourbons, and try to reestablish the legal order as it had been before.
So ultimately, is our best case scenario then? You say this is the most clear to to talk about, and you say it's only half done.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe there are other examples that are more successful that aren't coming to mind immediately. But
sure, well, let's talk about France.
Yeah, exactly. So in the French case, there were two parallel movements that were trying to gain legitimacy during the crumbling of Napoleonic France. There was a government that was set up by, I'm just going to use the English pronunciation, Talleyrand, who defected from basically every government he ever served, more or less, and he formed a provisional government which was accepted by the international Allied powers. But parallel to that, as I've written relatively at length about, I suppose, on my throughout a couple of threads, there was on Twitter, that is, there was another movement to try to restore Ancien as it was in sort of 1789, like right before the revolution really takes hold, restore everything back to how it was, including things like property relations. And they were building something more like a bottom-up movement. But when I say that, what I mean is that they were what they were explicitly doing was reconnecting aristocrats with one another and trying to get people who they knew would be relatively dependable. And that sounds like you're talking about not very many people who couldn't necessarily have that much impact, considering they've been institutionally locked out. But prior to the revolution, I think you're talking about something like 1 million titled aristocrats out of a total population of something like 25 million, I think it was.
Yeah, that's a ludicrous number.
You're still talking about quite a large number of people, and all of those people are going to be, men of some means by comparison to the general populace. So it definitely had the potential, and indeed was building into something that was going to be truly potent. But that whole process was cut short by the fact that Napoleon lost on the battlefield. The Allies started invading, and so they didn't have the opportunity to present the Allies with a fait accompli where they'd already retaken power from the Napoleonic government and reestablished the legal order as they wanted to. So they were always trying to change things from the outside of the Talleyrand government, which wanted to keep a good portion of the Napoleonic and revolutionary reforms, various elements of the constitution, and in particular property relations. So they never got their property fully returned.
Okay, so that's an example of a fight to restore a more sane order, in the aftermath of a leftist revolution.
Yeah.
How does this relate exactly to your talk? Because you're not going to just talk from your submission. It wasn't just on restoration. You had ideas on how you might make it specific to the English or Anglo case.
Yeah, so the particular angle that I've decided to take is one of mythic restoration, because this is a feature which is built into a number of different cultural and political traditions, where there is a set of stories and a culture of what the restoration will look like. So when you've had a people that have fallen from grace in some sense, they often have a story about specifically how they will come back to glory and be able to reassert themselves. So the two examples that I've decided to roll with as points of comparison, I suppose, or just to draw out this idea as something that has real power, are the Constantine of Greece and Byzantium. So the idea of the marble emperor and the specific connotations of that, and what a Greek revival and Greek restoration would look like in the form of Byzantium. So they talk about the restoration of the holy city, of course, the great city, and then the holy city. So Constantinople followed by Jerusalem, and furthermore, with all that being in place, they'll drive the Turks back to the red apple tree, I think it was. So that's not fully understood what is meant by that, but the idea of that being somewhere in it's just sort of mythologically considered to be the homeland of the Greeks. The Turks, sorry, rather. So the Turks are going to be sent back to where they came from, and the Greeks will be able to reassert their prime position in Anatolia and enjoy their former greatness.
Okay, so that'll be somewhere in Central Asia,
One would presume, yeah. But the interesting thing about that myth in particular is that you have a stage where they've almost fulfilled it, according to everything seems to be lining up. They have a new Constantine. They have massive reconquests that are taking place. Constantinople seems basically ripe for the taking, and they're even reinvading Anatolia, and then everything sort of falls apart. But the interesting thing in all of this is that even though the monarch gets overthrown, even the Republicans, who are theoretically opposing all of this, they still have to come up with their own theory as to where the red apple tree is. They have to play into this myth. So even the opponents of the the royalists who are pushing this kind of like reconquest and restoration, even they have to present, like, they have to work within the myth, and they have to present their own theories as to what all of these different mythical components mean, and set out parameters for success of the restoration.
So they had an equivalent cultural success to, say, Tony Blair in this country, where his opponents were still like working within his framework, but this was in a more grand and mythic sense. Yes,
exactly. And so that is what I would call essentially within the like rhetorical or the Overton windows kind of sphere in terms of the dialectic, I guess. That's when you've won in terms of these like mythical characteristics. So if we can get our opponents basically in our own context to be trying to find their own definitions for what these almost like inherently reactionary ideas are going to like signify, that's kind of when we win, because they're inhabiting our frame.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense to me. It's a grand ambition, though.
It is, yes.
Yeah,
but that's why recalling back to one of these older myths is I think the way to go about it, because everybody knows. I'll tip my hand a little bit. Everyone knows who King Arthur is, and I would say probably quite a few people have a good idea about the idea that he's supposed to come back at some point, and that there's an idea of like a returning King Arthur who's going to set the world right again, and that's what he did in the first place, and he will come to do so again.
Yeah. So, well, I understand that. I was just going to ask, what happened to our myths? Essentially, Arthur used to be a major part of the English life, right? An English mythos, as with all of the other knights, but they don't really seem to be talked about very much today. We talk a lot more about Tolkien than we do about the Knights of the Round Table. So what happened there? Are we culturally starting to forget these things, or do you think there's something deeper there that can actually be resurrected?
I don't necessarily agree that they have entirely faded. So there are definitely still people who are talking about this. In fact, I can't remember his name now, but do you know the Scottish fellow who always wears a scarf, has quite long hair, lives in Stirling, appears on GB News?
Oh, yes, and the host guy, he's called on Twitter.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Unfortunately, I can't remember his name either, but he was quite recently talking about the Arthurian myth, and touched a little bit on political Arthurianism as well, which is a term that I found appears in a few bits of literature here and there, because it's sort of like a reoccurring idea in English history. So resurrecting this myth periodically to try to force the country in a direction of sort of like restoring order, and I think that's exactly what's needed again. As for why people talk about it less, again, I don't necessarily think that they have. It's just something that's kind of like almost compartmentalized, because I've noticed that as I've started looking more for these topics, it's still being talked about in a very contemporary manner, and even within our sphere, there are people who are talking about it. So in particular, I believe Allrock on Twitter is someone who's been spent quite a long time now looking into the historical foundations of the Arthurian myth, and trying to draw out who exactly he may be based on, if he didn't, perhaps on the assumption that he didn't actually exist, or if he did exist, what exactly did he do, and what can be historically proven and corroborated with what other evidence we have.
So do you think he did actually exist, or is he completely made up?
No, I do think he did exist. There are a lot of different versions of what he actually did, but I'm quite convinced by the fact that in accounts that are much further back than some of the popularizing writings of Geoffrey of Monmouth and people like that, you still get people talking about and sort of like comparing present figures to Arthur as the gold standard of what a knight or a lord should be. And I find that quite compelling evidence that that he did in fact exist, and he was somebody who was powerful enough to leave a pretty indelible mark on the British psyche of his time.
All right, fair enough. This idea of there was a great time just before recorded history that we should hark back to, and people from that time may return, or at least the ideas should return, is seemingly fairly universal. I know the ancient Greeks, they talked a lot about the knowledge from Egypt and other places. If you to look into the Confucian tales, he is always harking back to the time that existed before the Great Order in China, which existed before he was around, and he was one of the few people who had traveled around the country gathering all of this hidden knowledge from the past. So is this something, when we're looking at England in particular with Arthur, but could this be extended into other countries?
Well, Rome is another big example of that. So the Romans had their own set of figures who exist in what for us I think is fairly murky territory in terms of historically speaking. So I believe there was three of the big ones that I've ended up talking about are Torquatus, who is almost like an avatar of Roman discipline, to the extent that when he was leading armies to defeat the Gauls, I believe it was, he executed his own son for going out to challenge a Gallic warrior when he'd been issued orders to the contrary, even though he'd actually won and brought, in theory, brought glory to Rome. But in the process, he disobeyed orders, and so he had to die.
Slightly extreme, don't you think?
Yeah, but it's like a gold standard for what Roman discipline ought to be. And so when Roman authors are talking about figures like Torquatus, or you could say the same about Cincinnatus, he's more famous for stepping up to do his duty and then going straight back to his performing his duty very effectively, and then withdrawing back to his personal matters and restoring things back to how they were before he was offered the dictatorship. So you've got humility there, and I think the Romans had a few of these types of figures who represent the absolute peak of whatever this virtue is that they're trying to demonstrate should be present in all Roman men too. Perhaps, well, ideally, all Roman men would be able to adhere to these levels. It's something to aspire to, but realistically, perhaps they were acknowledging that would never be the case. But at least it was something that they could point to and say, be like Torquatus, be like Cincinnatus.
Who are the Englishmen that we could use as examples of this? I know within Boomer, the more mainstream Boomer regime, people would talk about Churchill in that manner, where they talk about him being the best of British, for instance. But there's reasons why we might not want to use him as our prime example of virtue. Quite a few reasons. So who could we hold up apart from Arthur himself as in the mythic context? Because when you're talking about these Roman figures, those were not mythic. No,
they weren't. I suppose that would partially be like a process of exploration. So maybe we could. I can't help but think that would be a very good task for some of the poets in our sphere, for example, to try to draw out some of these figures. So obviously within the Arthurian legend, there's also the various knights who have their own exploits and their own strengths and weaknesses, and they go on their own quests and achieve their own things. So perhaps one of the projects of the some of the artists in our sphere would be to try to draw out the qualities that are common to those sort of older knights, and compare them to people who exist in slightly more contemporary society. Because I definitely know that there's a good few people who would conform to some of these ideals, like especially when you're talking about British conduct during the two world wars. Whatever you think about the particular ethics of the war itself and the justifications and the tactics that were used, there's an extreme amount of domestic heroism taking place.
Yes. Going back to you mentioned the Napoleonic Wars earlier, you can probably draw out Sir Sidney Smythe maybe as one of those people who were best of British going around the place fighting the French wherever he can, and doing very well.
Yeah. I was thinking probably of someone like David Sterling as well. He's a figure that I quite like from the more recent past, where he is essentially like a one-man restoration of the British Empire, I guess. He goes on his own sort of personal quest to try and maintain British influence however he can. And one of the ways he's doing this is just by trying to put up radio stations and things so that British radio and TV can still be broadcast in areas where the British establishment itself no longer cares to project that power.
Yeah, so there was lots of men, I suppose. If we think back to Empire, that were phenomenally accomplished.
Yeah.
So I suppose we can find them. We just need to bring them back into culture and present them in a way which the left can't just call them racist, colonialist pigs, maybe, or if they do, a way that we can defend them still. Who knows?
To me, the way of doing that would be to just emphasize the personal virtues that they had, I guess, and just go down that route and not look at them purely for the the outcome that they had, but more look at the fact that they achieved these things through strength of character. And that is kind of harder to tear down, I would say. So if you were to look at somebody like Robert Clive, although on the one hand you can talk about him in terms of being like a ruthless imperialist who subjugated the Indians, that's something that can be viewed in a positive or negative light depending on how you feel about the empire and the principle of subjugating other peoples.
Yes.
But you can also look at him in terms of his raw sort of initiative and how he went from he was in India as a clerk, as I understand it. He had an office job and he managed to wrangle himself a position as being the de facto the general of an army. The process of how that happens is obviously quite remarkable in itself, but the fact that he then goes on to be quite accomplished in that role as well is very remarkable.
Lots of these tales would make good films, for instance, and we haven't seen them. There should be. The only example I can think of off the top of my head was something like Lawrence of Arabia, where they have this buccaneering brig going out and about, but they don't see all these other tales of great men of empire seem to be unpopularized. They exist, and as you say, maybe some of the artistic, poetic people in our sphere could help draw them out. But so far, they haven't been. And do you have any idea why that might be the case?
It might be just something to do with the way that Britain has tended to move more towards a materialistic viewing, I suppose, of some of these things. I don't know. For some reason, what springs to mind is the anecdote about the making of A Bridge Too Far, the film.
Yes.
And the fact that the veterans of the battle who were brought on to check that everything was right were complaining that the depiction of the officers in that battle was inaccurate, because although they were ducking behind cover in the film and running from place to place as one would expect, in reality they were actually a lot more heroic, effectively. So they were pointing out that no, that's not how that happened. We didn't act like that because British officers don't duck, and you're never supposed to, as a British officer, give the sense that you're in any particular danger. And so there are anecdotes all over the place of people who fought at the Battle of Arnhem, strolling around as though there is nothing going on at all, even though they're under tremendous pressure. But because of the way that the film had to be produced, they thought it would be too unrealistic to actually portray things as they happened.
So we're saying British glory and virtue is too unbelievable for modern audience.
Yes.
Amazing. Okay, well, do you have anything else you want to mention on your talk, or we should leave it on that beautifully high note?
I think that's a pretty good place to leave it. Actually, I guess I would say that trying to draw a through line between some of these figures and some of these historical figures of the fairly recent past, and either to the heroes of like ancient Greece and trying to draw parallels to that kind of style of writing, which is kind of the line that I lean towards, or to the Arthurian knights, because a lot of these people had their own objectives and their own sort of quests that they were on, and so portraying them in those kinds of light would probably help to, I suppose, encourage our people to think about their own struggles in this same kind of capacity, and I think that's probably very useful because it encourages a line of thinking, I would say, where people are going to try to act less as a corpus, I suppose, less as an organization with distinct parts and hierarchies, and more as sort of their own adventurers who are going to go and seek their own glories and then bring back actions rather than promises and loyalty. Loyalty is important, of course, but it's better to be able to present results rather than just words.
Always is. And on that note, I think we'll call this interview to a close. If you want to see Rupert talk about restoration and revolution, then make sure to get your ticket for the Witan. There'll be links in the description. We have a few more interviews coming up still, so also like this video, subscribe, share it to people you think might be interested, and we'll see you all very soon. Goodbye.
Hope to see you there.